Ladies and gentlemen, the PlayStation 5 Pro is coming, at least according to a plethora of rumours that have been circulating online from myself as well as many other sources. And the console would offer, of course, significant improvements for its entire set of specifications. GPU, CPU, memory, and so on would all see significant upticks. The goal would be to empower developers to incorporate features like multi-bounce ray tracing, higher resolutions, frame rates, and basically offer a premium experience for those with, let's say, 4K 120Hz TVs, yes, but also PSVR 2. There have been also a number of specifications that have started to leak online, for example 30 workgroup processors. I first hinted this myself in a couple of videos, and then since then we've seen Tom Henderson basically report much the same thing. And from my own information from older performance targets anyway, I heard a 2 times increase in raster and around a 2.5 times that in ray tracing. But there have also been some very interesting conflicting information that I've personally been hearing. And in this video then, I wanted to break down several things that I've been hearing about the machine and kind of give you my thoughts so far on the system. Now, I have to say that from my current understanding, Sony are definitely working on the system. There have at the very minimum been prototypes. But of course, whether these actually see the light of day or not is, well, still too early to guess. At the moment, the market simply is in a state of flux. And even many companies, for example AMD, have recently cancelled the high-end RDNA 4 GPUs. It's going to be very interesting to see how this filters down to the PS5, for example, particularly given Microsoft are just not going to be releasing a Pro Xbox Series X system. We're going to get into all of this and more after this message from the video's sponsor.
If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by whokeys.com, and they've an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out whokeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices.
So then, let me repeat myself. I do believe that Sony have been working on a PlayStation 5 Pro. The problem that I've heard from a couple of sources, however, comes down to the code name. Now, code names are an interesting one. For example, I leaked Xbox Sabin. Now, Sabin is not the code name of the actual console. Instead, it was the codename of the APU which would find itself inside the console. With the PS5 Pro, there have been a couple of codenames which we've heard floating around. The first is Viola. Now, I believe I was the first to leak this back in perhaps May. I was hearing that that was a codename that was associated with the APU inside the console, and this does seem to be the case. KeplerL2 on Twitter has also stated that this seems to be right. However, the codename for the actual console, at least according to Tom Henderson, is allegedly Trinity. Now, this is where things get a little spicier because I'm uncertain whether that is the appropriate codename. A couple of my sources have outright told me that this is the codename for the console. However, I've also had pushback from a couple of very good sources, and they have essentially told me that this is not the case. You may recall, for example, that the PS4 Pro codename was actually Neo, whereas on the other hand, consoles like the PS5 have instead had names such as Tempest for the audio, or Oberon. Now, obviously that's a very different thing indeed. So the problem with Trinity, from what I've heard anyway from a couple of sources, is that it is not the codename for the PS5 Pro, instead it is for a cancelled other project. Now, I do know what that project is. Unfortunately, I've been asked to not state what the project was. But it doesn't matter anyway because the project's dead. However, as I said, it's for another project which is essentially dead. Now, this, however, doesn't mean that, technically speaking, Sony could not have reused that codename. There is nothing, legally speaking, or, risen, at least according to my knowledge, within the company that says, no, actually, we just cannot ever reuse a codename. And it's not like this hasn't happened anyway. Not quite the same thing, but for example, Venice for AMD CPUs back in the day was for a socket 939 CPU. This is really long time ago. This was like Athlon 64 days. It was a single core processor. I owned one and it kicked ass. I think I overclocked it to like 2.7, 2.8 gigahertz or something like that from the 1.8 gigahertz stock. It was really impressive stuff. However, now Venice is being associated with a high-end server CPU for the next generation. In other words, codenames can be reused, so it's very possible that that's what is happening with Sony. But again, to my knowledge anyway, the codename that I've heard Trinity associated with is nothing to do with the PS5 Pro. Now, it is possible that Tom's information is correct and it is being used for both. However, that's besides the point. However, his other information does seem to be pinpoint, and I have also heard 30 workgroup processors and also the same memory speed, but let's talk more about that. I was, however, told that there are multiple variants of the PS5 Pro specs, and I think at this point one has won, or at least gotten very close to winning, but definitely, to my understanding, there wasn't just one considered design. It doesn't work like that in the real world. Like, no console has ever had just one design considered, because a lot of stuff changes during the design process. For example, Sony's internal teams, they want the very best technical excellence. So you've got companies like, studios like Naughty Dog, for example. And obviously they are going to have ideas. But remember, an idea, it costs money. So not only do you have to worry about the size of the actual chip, for example, if you're adding more compute units or workgroup processors, it becomes bigger. More RAM costs more money. Higher clock frequency means that there could be a lower yields, so on and so on. And there's also the scope of the project and timelines. How long does a hardware feature take to figure out, build, then incorporate it in a chip? For example, let's say you have a feature, it doesn't matter what it is, it really doesn't, but you have an idea for a feature on an APU, and it's really cool, it would improve performance, it would do whatever. However, you're like, it's probably going to take 2 years to actually figure out how this is going to work, build it, test it, and our timeline to launch the console is 3 years, or let's just hypothetically say, and we actually need to provide development kits to studios, and we also need to mass produce the hardware, and we also need to write all of the SDKs and actually provide documentation and stuff like that. What happens if this slips? What's the ramifications of that? What if it slips a month, or 2 months, or 3 months, or 6 months? What do we do? And these are just these are very simplified examples. It's a lot more complicated in real life. Honestly, I'm really simplifying this, guys. But it's not just a case of, oh, more T-flops. Like, CPU core count, T-flops, clock frequency, they get the attention. The amount of RAM in a console, it gets the attention. But the devil is always in the details. If you suffer a cache miss, it can really murder performance, intercore latency, or just actually any latency, even like the choice of RAM. It's not just the frequency of the memory. Like, the actual timing of memory is really important. It can have massive ramifications on frame time misses, and even things like saying improved ray tracing. But exactly what was improved? Are we talking about faster intersection testing? Are we talking about better BVH reversal? Is there some type of dedicated hardware to actually do BVH reversal on the PS5 Pro? Or is it still being run like any RDNA 2 based GPU like the Xbox or the PS5 or PC hardware? The BVH reversal is essentially still done using compute. So the ray intersection testing is done on the TMUs, the texture mapping units. This is well established, you can Google it. And then basically the actual BVH, which is the sorting of the scene, the hierarchy of the scene data, that is still being done essentially as compute. Now, NVIDIA have dedicated hardware, and the rumor is that RDNA 4 does as well. We'll get more into that in a moment. So we know Sony is buggering around with RT. For example, was the patent I've discussed dozens of times now, which is basically ray shortening. Now, that seems to be one thing that they've incorporated in the PS5 Pro, potentially because there's a patent. And there's also the internal presentation, which shows things like ray tracing upscaling. But how applicable was any of that to the PS5 Pro? I honestly don't know. And I'm told that Sony tested multiple different configurations of the APU and the rest of the specs. And as I said, this is not uncommon in the industry. Sega famously had two totally different Dreamcast designs. In fact, I think it was 3DFX literally sued Sega because they pretty much said that they were going to go with Sega. Sega was going to go with 3DFX. And I can't remember what the CPU was. It might have been SH4 still. I genuinely don't remember the CPU configuration. But they were going to go with 3DFX Voodoo. And then they didn't. They ended up going Power VR. And I think one of the main reasons they actually went with Power VR, I think there were a few. One was the Japanese branch of Sega. They basically were creating two different variants. I think the US variant was 3DFX, and I think the Japanese one was Power VR. And one of the things that they did is because 3DFX announced it early, I think. But there were some other things as well. You can do some interesting reading on that. It's very interesting. Also, Microsoft bumped the clock frequency up of the Xbox One last minute, CPU and GPU. In fact, speaking of Microsoft, they were originally going to go with the AMD Athlon CPU instead of the Pentium 3 Hybrid, I think. That's for the original Xbox. Sony also doubled the RAM of the PS4 close to launch, and Sony's APU underwent a ton of changes for the PS5. Very early variants literally did not even have ray tracing because the feature was not built yet. It came later. So very early development kits quite literally did not have ray tracing, as far as I understand it. But anyway, talking about the specifications generally, I'm hearing that they're basically 8 Zen 4 cores, they're custom, 30 workgroup processors, probably an RDNA 3 based IP, or it might be 3.5, we'll get more into that in a second, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and there could be also some DDR5 memory for the OS, much higher clock frequency, I heard, over 3.6 for the CPU and possibly 2.7-ish for the GPU. SSD improvements, I have absolutely no detail, I'm going to assume it's faster, I don't honestly know. I was told 96 ROPs, I was told 3 shader arrays, we'll get more into that in a moment along with the ROPs, and TSMC's 5 or 4 nm, I don't know which. So beginning with the CPU, I don't think Zen 5 is being used here because of development cycles. I don't think Zen 5 was far enough in development. I don't have a straight answer to that. It could possibly change in the final variant, but I think it's Zen 4, which is still going to be a massive increase in performance in terms of IPC, and you're also going to have much higher clock frequency. I think Sony are going to do the exact same thing that they did with the PS5. With the PS5, they snipped the FP units. They basically did that so that the console wouldn't have to run heavy AVX workloads, and they did some other things like intercore latency and caches, basically minimizing the latency between caches and other bits and pieces. And I assume they're going to do very similar for the PS5 Pro. They don't need to use heavy AVX. They're probably going to see much more GPU compute on the PS5 Pro, that's a guess. I don't think we're going to see any more than 8 processor cores. It's just more work for the developers. I think 3 gigahertz, high 3 gigahertz, is going to be quite likely, but don't take that as confirmation. Final clock frequencies won't be decided yet. It's not until we get closer to mass production, and the consoles are definitely not close to mass production. I've also heard from one source it's Zen 4C, which basically the same thing as Zen 4. The only difference is they're denser. This has already been disclosed by AMD. It's already a product which is available. Mostly, though, it's designed around servers. The problem is, because the core itself, the FP units, the integer units, everything is just so much denser. It's packed into such a smaller amount of space. I think it's like 35 or 40% reduction in space. I can't remember the exact size now. But because it's so much denser, it also means it's a lot more thermally dense. So clock frequency could be a problem, and it may not increase the clock frequency that much over the vanilla console. RDNA 3.5 is a hybrid RDNA 3 architecture. It has some elements of RDNA 4. This is also pretty well established. Strix Point for the PC launches, well, I say PC, it's going to be mostly mobile. Strix Point launches next year, from what I understand, and we've already seen some benchmarks about Strix Point, and it does include some things like Salo improvements. Unfortunately, when it comes to custom hardware on consoles, it's much harder to pin down because they basically just chop and change IPs and put a crap ton of custom stuff. I already mentioned about the ray shortening patent, but there was also a patent from AMD themselves, which I was told by a couple of sources is for RDNA 4. It makes sense given the patent's timing. Basically speaking, what it does is it seems to have some type of BVH traversal hardware. You may recall what I said earlier, where the BVH traversal is done using shaders. Basically, instructions run on the compute units, the shaders. What this does, from what I understand, reading the patent and from what a couple of sources have told me, is it's more NVIDIA-like in how it does things. Basically, it offloads it to a separate piece of silicon. It's still on the GPU, but it's not being run anymore in software. Now, it's possible this is the PS5 Pro as well, which uses this, but it would depend on timing and whether that's even true. I don't know. 30 workgroup processors was something Tom leaked, and I've also mentioned it several times myself, even back in May. This is a fairly safe bet, honestly, because even if you're just guessing, you can look at the size of the N32 based RDNA 3 GCD, which is the compute unit, and that's about 200 square millimeters on TSMC's N5 process. You can't completely compare a console GPU to a PC based one due to lots of custom work, but I have heard that Sony are probably going to go 3 to 350 square millimeters for their console, but honestly, I wouldn't pay much attention to that at all at this stage. The issues with all of this is 30 the total number on the die, or is it active? So for example, are there a higher number of workgroup processors and only 30 of them are enabled? So for example, is there like 36 workgroup processors and 30 are enabled, or is 30 the total number and only let's say 27 are enabled? What is the clock frequency? I've heard it's higher than the base model. And finally, is any of that true? Because maybe it is not true at all. Maybe it was a specific variant that isn't actually launching and the real number is considerably more or considerably less. Because we do not know the final clock frequency, performance is really difficult to nail down. I've also heard that there are 3 shader engines in the design. This is 6 shader arrays. This is very similar to what we saw with N32, so that would mean that there's 10 workgroup processors. Now, for reference, as I said, that would be similar to N32, and speculatively it would mean that it would be easier perhaps for the PS5 because you could just disable shader arrays and downclock the GPU. I've also, as you can see on screen, decided to do some calculations for you guys on 30, 28 and 27 workgroup processors across various speeds, and you can see their T-flops. There is also the thing that RDNA 3 is technically dual issue instructions on FP32, which is full precision operations. I've already broken this down in a separate RDNA 3 video way back when it launched on PC, but you can basically double FP32 performance essentially with this, but it is not applicable for all instructions and doesn't necessarily benefit games on the PC. Now, whether Sony incorporates this and how it differs, if at all, to the PC implementation, and if developers leverage this at all, I have no idea. It's speculative. So T-flops, again, don't necessarily mean a whole lot. I was also told that for the version of Viola that I heard about, we're looking at 96 ROPS. This is 50% higher than the base model Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5. ROPS are used for pixel fill rate, and this is really important for things like when dealing with screen space effects, and games like Final Fantasy XVI absolutely murder fill rate, pixel fill rate, should I say. and it directly impacts the ability of the hardware to deal with high resolutions. I am, as always, really simplifying things here. Now, fill rate is dictated to by the number of ROPs multiplied by the clock frequency of the GPU. You can see here I'm using an NVIDIA RTX 3080, as it coincidentally has 96 ROPs, and I am being really lazy and can't be bothered to switch to an AMD based GPU for this testing, and there's no point using a 4090 or something like that for testing because it's just got way more ROPs. But what you can see is just a small increase in the clock frequency basically increases the 150 megahertz, increases the pixel fill rate by quite a bit. The fill rate of the PS5 base model is 143 G pixels, thanks to the clock frequency and the number of ROPs. So that's 64 multiplied by 2,230. So if 96 is right, and again, it could be reduced on the final model, maybe they have poor yields or whatever, that would obviously really impact the fill rate. And you can see it again on screen. So 96 ROPs, for example, at 2500 megahertz is 240 G pixels. 2800 megahertz is just under 270 G pixels. And, well, yeah, again, you can see on screen. What about memory? Oh boy, memory is a fun subject. And by fun, I mean it's maddening and makes you just want to scream. I've had very conflicting specifications regarding memory. According to Tom H's info, it seems that the frequency of the memory, the speed, is 18 Gbps. Assuming that's correct, though, it still doesn't help us worth a crap because we don't have the bus width. You can see on screen some examples based on different memory configurations, 256 as well as 320-bit. The only thing that one source has told me is that there could be DDR5 memory, but that's not the first time that Sony have done something like that. With the PS4 Pro, there was GDDR5 for the main system memory, and there was 1 gigabyte, I think, of DDR3, which was used for the OS. It's possible they did that for the PS5 Pro, but I don't know. From what I'm hearing, it seems 16 gigabytes is probably right, but whether that's with the DDR5 memory as well, I don't know. I honestly couldn't. I have no confidence in the memory configuration. I think 16 gigabytes is more likely. But an interesting thing I have heard, and this is through the grapevine, and this is not a leak because it is super wishy-washy. But as I mentioned earlier, latency is a really big issue getting stuff done in the hardware. So you've got a lot of latency points. That's not really a thing, but you get my idea. So pulling data from the SSD to memory, or even GDDR6 has higher latency, for example. So if you have cache misses, it can be pretty painful. Now, Sony have done a lot when it comes to caches, not least of which are things like cache scrubbers, which basically eliminate old data and just basically manage it. And this is something that the developer doesn't have to worry about. It's essentially automated. And believe it or not, that's actually a really big performance win, and also stops developers from wanting to, just cry. Cache optimization is a really big point, especially when you're doing things, dealing with stuff like registers. But I've also heard the company are essentially considering a large amount of cache bolted onto the chip. Now, I want to stress so much that this is not a leak. I've heard that they were considering if it was viable, and this could be done with, let's say, X3D cache, which is available on AMD CPUs now, but I assume it would be modified to also run on the GPU as well. So it'd be some type of unified cache, maybe HBM, but all of this would cost money. And frankly, I'm somewhat skeptical this is true of the PS5 Pro. I'm adding it here because I've heard it mentioned, and Sony apparently were looking at it internally, but just because something is looked at, it doesn't mean it's actually something that happens. For example, Zen 5 L2 caches, they were testing them at 1 megabyte, which is what the cache size is going to be for L2 on Zen 5, it looks like, based on all the information that's coming out. But they also tested them at, I think 2 and 3 megabytes, but they never did it. They were just basically testing to see how much of a performance win it would be. So this is one of those situations where it may not happen for the PS5 Pro, it might not even happen for the PS6. So again, I would not take that as a leak. I'm saying it's a point of interest, but I don't necessarily know if it would happen. So the development kit I was also told about, or at least on the APU, the Tempest engine is also apparently improved significantly. I've spoken about this before, but the TE on the PS5 base model is used for audio. But it's basically a modified RDNA 2 compute unit using DMA, direct memory access. And this can be used for a number of things. Essentially, it can run like the PS3's Cell in some respects. And I was told by a developer that it can actually offload stuff like BVH traversal. Now, obviously, that is not official Sony information. They did confirm, Mark Cerny, that it runs basically like the PS3 Cell, you know, in the Road to PS5 event, but it doing other stuff other than audio is not confirmed. That's just what I've heard. So anyway, what I will say is that allegedly for the PS5 Pro, they were considering doubling it up. But again, a plan is not the same thing as they do end up doing it. But what about Xbox? Well, I've already leaked about Xbox Sabin, as I said earlier. This was supposedly an Xbox Series S, but hyped up absolutely ridiculously. Now, it was supposedly going to be targeting about the same price point, but it was based on RDNA 3 and Zen 4. I don't know the exact RDNA version. I heard 3.5 from one person, and someone else just told me it was RDNA 3, so your guess is as good as mine. It had more GPU compute than a Series S, but not as much as a Series X. But it has more RAM. I wasn't given an exact figure. 12 gigabytes seemed to be right, but I couldn't get it confirmed. More importantly, though, had some type of ML block to upscale games. The project was canned. Phil Spencer also crapped on the idea of a high-performance Xbox Series console. In other words, more powerful than a Series X. Now, there's a lot of variables, therefore, for the PS5 Pro. I'm now told by a single source backing up older information that I got from another source a long time ago, that Microsoft had internally considered a more powerful Xbox system. The specs had not been decided and the plans were not very far in motion, and basically it was just canned. Now, the reason Sabin was canned, which again is not the project name, it was the APU name, they were basically just concerned that they were going to overwhelm the developers. So really for Microsoft, it just depends on the state of the project itself. Personally speaking, I would not be holding my breath for Microsoft to release a pro Xbox console for this generation. I mean, they kind of have already said, as everyone knows at this point, that the Series X was the pro console. And I think that it's more likely, and this is not a leak, this is just me spitballing. I think it's more likely that Microsoft will just say, you know what, let's just hold fire until the next generation and kind of do a reset. I suspect, although again, this is not a leak, I suspect Microsoft are much more likely to go with a one SKU strategy next time round. In other words, not a Series S and X, and instead their lower end offering will basically just be streaming. Again, I could be totally wrong, and it really just does depend on how much they feel that they benefited from the Series S in terms of actual money. In other words, how many consoles they sold, how much cash they bought back versus PR, and all of these other things that, quite frankly, are well outside of the scope of this video to discuss. The Series S, I think many would agree, has been an excellent entry-level machine, so it's going to be very interesting to see what Microsoft does for the next generation. As for the PS5 Pro, will it ever see the light of day? Well, things honestly are very difficult. I am very confident that Sony were working on the machine, but unfortunately projects get started, cancelled, restarted all of the time. And it's not like the money is totally written off anyway through how taxes and that type of thing work, you know, if a project isn't released. My guess is that it's going to really depend on a lot of factors at this point in the market. The PS5 is selling extremely well. Obviously, at the end of the day, that is what really matters. I have absolutely no idea what the final retail price of the PS5 Pro would be. I initially was hearing that it was going to be very expensive, but perhaps that was before cost downs and stuff like that, so maybe they decided to go a slightly different route and make the machine cheaper. I personally would not hold my breath until Sony announces something. Perhaps we're going to get more definitive leaks and more information within the next several months. I mean, let's face it, if development kits are starting to ship out soon, at least to a wider audience, we should in theory start to know more. What I can tell you guys is that I've spoken to some developers and they've now told me that basically they're under NDA for the new Nintendo console, but as of the time I've last spoken to a couple of people, people who work for third-party companies, so, you know, just example, these are not the developers that they've worked for, but just for example, Capcom, they have not yet been briefed about a PS5 Pro. Again, that is not to say that they won't be briefed, you know, tomorrow. I think the general consensus from people that I've heard is that the console probably will launch. And I personally would love a PS5 Pro to launch because I would just kind of like to see what happens. But as with all, as with anything, we're just going to have to wait and see. The PC market in particular has been very volatile at the moment. I mean, just very recently we were talking about the fact that the high-end RDNA 4 GPUs are basically canned. That's N41, N42. We've known the designs and all of that stuff. And it's basically due to timelines. And AMD wanted to put more resources into the high-end RDNA 5 GPUs because it was just going to take them too long to get some of the technology working for RDNA 4. That's kind of roughly anyway. I'm missing several points out for this video because it doesn't really matter. My point is that I think it's also going to be down to timelines, whether they feel like it's a big enough upgrade, whether they think that it's worth it in terms of marketing, and honestly, just the general state of the world. Like, do they feel that the world would be ready and willing to tolerate it, especially given the fact that the console, the PS5 I mean, just had such a shortage initially. Although, I will say, now it is selling extremely well. Let me know your thoughts below. Are you interested in the PS5 Pro? What would be the maximum that you're willing to pay for the damn thing? And I suppose the question from my perspective that I'd like to ask you, if you're a PS5 user already, would you upgrade? And if you are not a PS5 owner, let's say you have a PS4 or you're more of a PC gamer, would there be a willingness there to upgrade, especially with the prices of PC hardware at the moment? Let me know your thoughts and opinions on this one, guys. I'm very curious to hear what you think. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.